The projector clattered to life at 7:03 p.m. on a rain-slick Friday in Seattle. The sound, a familiar, comforting grind against the nervous energy thrumming through the air. Outside, the city lights smeared into watercolor streaks on the wet pavement. But inside, in the dim, musty cavern of the Callahan cinema, there was only the focused beam of light cutting through the dust motes. I watched the last reel Maggie Callahan ever shot begin to spin. It was the last theater standing the original. The one with the velvet seats so deeply worn, they felt like cradles. Though now the velvet was patched, and the air smelled faintly of mildew, and the desperate hope of restoration. The marquee above us was missing the sea, a vacant spot where our legacy used to shine. 500 strangers, drawn by rumor, curiosity, or perhaps a shared, unspoken sense of injustice, sat waiting. Then the image stabilized. A face drawn tight with the finality of illness but possessing eyes that burned with volcanic intent, stared directly into the lens. It was Maggie, the queen of Seattle's indie film scene, the woman who built an empire out of celluloid and stubborn will. "They stole my life," she whispered, her voice thin, but amplified perfectly by the ancient sound system. "Now you steal it back." In the third row directly where I had positioned them, a sharp, crystalline sound cut through the silence. Nathan Callahan's champagne flute slipped from his fingers and shattered like ice on concrete. His gasp was audible, a visceral tearing in the quiet theater. Because the woman on the screen, my mother-in-law, the woman who was supposed to be nothing more than a recent quiet statistic, wasn't supposed to know. And the woman holding the remote, the woman who had meticulously planned this final act of cinematic vengeance, wasn't supposed to fight back. That woman was me. Emily Callahan, formerly Harper. I stood alone in room 412 of Harborview Medical Center when the heart monitor flattened at 4:17 p.m. on that particular Friday. The scent of bleach and lukewarm vending machine coffee clung to the air like a shroud. Maggie Callahan, the titan whose shadow had loomed over my entire marriage, took her last rattling breath and left the planet without a single Callahan at her bedside. Nathan, my husband, was conveniently crashing on a potential Series B funding round down in San Francisco, a city he'd claimed suddenly required his full undivided attention. Lila, my sister-in-law, whose capacity for sincerity matched the length of her designer fingernails, had texted from a rooftop bar in Capitol Hill times, "Tell her," I said by lol, asterisk. The nurse, a kind woman named Maria, whose eyes carried the weary softness of too many goodbyes, pressed something cool and metallic into my palm. It was a dented film canister, the kind used for transporting sensitive reels decades ago. Maggie made me swear Maria whispered her gaze flicking toward the closed door, only after the flatline. Inside, nestled in the protective foam, was one 8-minute reel, labeled Times Reel, 7 times in confident looping red grease pencil. Beside it lay a heavy old brass key stamped with the same number. I didn't go straight home to the echoing loft in Belltown we shared with Nathan. I drove north, crossing the water, as the late afternoon sun fought a losing battle against the persistent Seattle drizzle. I took the ferry, watching the city skyline Maggie's kingdom recede into the mist. It wasn't until the city lights bled across the darkening expanse of Puget Sound, until I reached the quiet solitude of the island, that I allowed myself to assemble the pieces. The attic of our Belltown loft was a museum of Maggie's forgotten dreams. Old cameras, dusty scripts, and that ancient hulking 35mm projector she insisted on keeping, claiming digital was sterile. I threaded Times Reel 7 times into the gate. The image flickered to life, a baptism of grain and shadow. Maggie, gaunt and frail but illuminated by an inner fire, sat in the very room where I now stood, room 412. Frame by frame, the truth unspooled with the sickening precision of a perfectly cut narrative. It wasn't a confession, it was an indictment. There were digital screenshots of bank transfers, large, untraceable movements routed through shell corporations. There were magnified images of forged signatures, documents, transferring millions from Maggie's primary trusts into accounts controlled solely by Nathan and Lila. The audio track, low but clear, played snippets from hidden cameras Maggie had somehow installed in the memory care ward where they'd sequestered her. I watched Lila, her face flushed with illicit excitement hissing into the silence of the common room. She won't remember by morning. Just sign the papers, Agnes. My hands, which had trembled only hours before signing the final death certificate, were now rock steady as I watched the evidence stack against the two people I'd built a life around. The final shot was the most devastating. Maggie positioned so close to the lens that her breath fogged the glass, her eyes sharp as broken shards of emerald glass leaned forward. Everything they didn't find is yours. Emily, her voice commanded. The cabin on Orcus, the trust in the Caymans, the theaters. Make them sit in the dark and watch the credits roll. The reel ended abruptly, followed by the clank of the take-up reel. I sat there, breathing in the scent of hot film and betrayal, until the reality of her final instructions set in. Asterisk. The key. Asterisk. The brass key, stamped with a 7, opened a cedar-shingled cabin tucked away on a cliff above Rosario Strait. The fog curled off the water like smoke, escaping an old film gate, obscuring the world, until only this small, damp sanctuary remained. Inside, it wasn't empty. It was a vault. Ledgers detailed every illicit transaction. USB drives contained encrypted files, the keys to unlocking the offshore accounts. And there, lying on a simple pine desk, was a new will notarized 3 months prior, leaving 100% of the Callahan estate, the properties, the liquid assets, the very name to Emily Harper Callahan. The condition was stark public screening of Times, real, 7 times exactly 7 days after burial in the last Callahan theater still standing. The funeral was a performance I was forced to endure. It was a mausoleum of hypocrisy. 20 mourners, half of them real estate vultures smelling opportunity, circled the lingering scent of inheritance. Nathan, back from SF, with hollow eyes and a newly tailored suit, wore mirrored sunglasses indoors, a parody of grief. Lila live-streamed her tears, pausing only to check her ring light positioning. I played the grieving widow, the quiet survivor, nodding faintly at condolences I knew were rooted in property lines, not pity. 7 nights later, the old Callahan Cinema reopened. It was a resurrection. Free tickets flooded Eventbrite. The buzz was intoxicating morbid. I stood behind the concession stand, watching the crowd filter. In a strange mix of film buffs, old theater employees Maggie had once championed, and hundreds of people who simply wanted to see the spectacle of a wealthy family imploding. I sold popcorn myself. My hands were steady, my smile razor-thin, perfectly calibrated to mask the internal scaffolding holding me upright. They arrived late. Nathan and Lila propelled forward by a mixture of righteous anger and the magnetic pull of the spectacle. I had them ushered to the reserved seats I'd chosen dead center. The 3rd row aisle seats the prime viewing position for maximum humiliation. Family honor, I'd told the nervous ushers, the words feeling like perfectly scripted dialogue. The house lights dimmed. The familiar, comforting, expensive darkness of the Callahan Cinema settled over us. My breath hitched not from fear but anticipation. The projector up. Asterisk reel, 7 times began. Gasps rippled through the audience as Maggie's voice, spectral, yet commanding, filled the house. The low-fidelity soundtrack, the deliberate graininess, it was all vintage Maggie designed to feel intimate and damning. Phones rose like periscopes, attempting to capture the uncapturable truth. By minute 4, Nathan was on his feet, his composure shattering faster than his champagne flute had. "Turn it off," he roared, his voice echoing off the high ceiling. "This is slander, that's not real." He lunged toward the projection booth. My security detail, 2 burly off-duty cops I'd hired under the guise of managing the expected crowds, moved with quiet efficiency, escorting him back to his seat. He slumped down, breathing hard, realizing he was trapped. Lila, ever the opportunist, tried to bolt for the side exit. I'd known she would. She didn't understand the rules of my final cut. The heavy wrought iron exit doors remained locked. The clause was simple times. No one leaves until the credits roll. Asterisk. I watched my husband and my sister-in-law squirm in the harsh light of their exposure, trapped in the velvet cage Maggie had built for them. Lila hissed something inaudible about defamation. Nathan was pleading silently with his eyes, looking at me as if I were a stranger who had stolen his wife. When the final frame froze on Maggie's unflinching stare, the one that dared them to try and erase her, the screen cut abruptly to black. Silence. Profound, terrifying silence. Then the house lights blazed up blindingly bright. The sudden illumination was a spotlight on a crime scene. Two detectives, stern-faced men in ill-fitting suits, were waiting just off the stage steps, warrants in hand. For wire fraud, elder abuse, and forgery, Nathan surged upward, a wild animal finally cornered. He vaulted over the third-row railing, ignoring the murmurs of the audience landing heavily on the aisle carpet and scrambling toward the stage. "You bitch, Emily! You orchestrated this entire performance," he screamed, lunging for me. I didn't flinch. I didn't retreat. I stood center stage, bathed in the white glare of the house lights, clutching the remote control, the true scepter of my reclaimed power. "Sit down, Nathan," I said, my voice perfectly level amplified by the stage microphone I hadn't turned off. "The feature's just starting." The Callahan Cinema became my command center. While Nathan sat in a holding cell awaiting arraignment, and Lila nervously retained the city's most expensive, panicked defense attorney, I went to ground. I spent weeks immersed in the dusty sanctuary of the Orcas Island cabin, fueled by instant coffee and the burning clarity of purpose. I lived in flannel shirts and worked under the beam of a headlamp, cataloging decades of 35mm home movies Maggie had secretly digitized. These weren't just family archives. They were forensic evidence. There was the footage of Nathan years younger, charming a vulnerable property owner into signing over an easement, the conversation laced with thinly veiled threats. There were candid moments of Lila practicing her caring daughter smile in the mirror before visiting Maggie. And then there was the hardest discovery, the one that solidified the righteousness of my crusade, a cache of high-resolution photographs hidden beneath the floorboards of the cabin's master bedroom. The images confirmed what the ledgers hinted at. The Cayman account wasn't just for hiding assets, it was funding a parallel life. There was a condo in the affluent Kitsilano neighborhood of Vancouver, registered under the name of Nathan's executive assistant, a quiet woman named Chloe. And in one photograph, Chloe was holding a toddler, a boy barely 3 years old, with unmistakably Callahan eyes the same shade of deep, skeptical gray as Nathan's. The betrayal wasn't just financial, it was biological. Maggie had protected this secret, likely out of a desperate love for the innocence of a child, while allowing Nathan to bleed her estate dry. I filed for divorce the same week. The FBI froze Nathan's burgeoning tech startup, citing evidence of massive systematic fraud that predated our marriage. Simultaneously, I anonymously forwarded the condominium photos and the child's birth records to Lila's largest sponsor, a luxury wellness brand whose entire ethos rested on family values and unimpeachable integrity. The fallout was spectacular. Lila's influencer deals evaporated overnight. The hashtag number elder abuse trended higher than any sponsored post she'd ever purchased. Her public tears looked suddenly very cheap. The court proceedings were swift, brutally efficient, and for me, immensely satisfying. The judge, a stern woman in her late 60s, turned out to be a classic film enthusiast, a man who had apparently grown up sneaking into Callahan matinees as a child. He requested times real 7 times be played in chambers. I didn't need to be present for the verdict. When I returned to the courthouse the following day, the judge looked at me with an almost reverent expression. "Mrs. Callahan," he said, tapping his pen on the stack of evidence. "Your late mother-in-law left quite the compelling closing argument. Nathan received 7 years. The financial crimes were irrefutable, and the judge, citing the cruelty of the elder abuse, showed no leniency for the Stanford MBA. Lila, given her lack of direct signatory power over the major accounts, received probation's significant restitution payments that she would realistically never earn back, and a permanent mark against her digital footprint. I kept the theaters. It was Maggie's final non-negotiable condition, and it felt like taking the crown she'd intended for me. But I couldn't run the empire of glitz and greed Nathan and Lila had envisioned. I gutted the marquees. I didn't bother repairing the missing C. Instead, I poured foundation money, the very money they had tried to steal, into establishing the Callahan Free House. It wasn't a single location. It was a non-profit chain dedicated to screening the classics Fellini, Kurosawa, Hitchcock, and yes, Maggie's early, fiercely independent work. The audience was specific seniors, memory care residents, the lonely, anyone who had ever felt left in the dark or forgotten by the rush of modern life. Friday nights became sacred. Free popcorn open captions for the hearing impaired, and no one ever turned away. 1 year to the day after the shattering premiere of Time's Reel, 7 times I stood on the restored stage of the original Callahan cinema. The rain had stopped, and a clear, crisp Seattle evening had settled over downtown. Behind me, mounted above the screen, a new sign glowed. Asterisk. Asterisk. Reel 7. The Retribution. Asterisk. Asterisk. The house was packed again. 500 people, loyalists and newcomers alike, eager for the anniversary screening. They weren't here for scandal anymore. They were here for the legacy I had rebuilt. I gripped the remote for my final piece of footage. This one wasn't grainy or accusatory. It was clear, high-definition shot with the expensive digital camera I'd found tucked away in Maggie's safe deposit box. I pressed play. The screen filled with footage of me. Emily alone in room 412, my face pale beneath the fluorescent lights, threading the ancient 35mm reel into the projector. The next sequence was shot from the other side of the attic door. Emily locking the door behind Nathan's pleading, distorted silhouette as he hammered for entry, his promises now sounding like hollow cliches echoing down the hallway. The film was a quiet documentary of ownership of choices made in isolation. Then the final shot of the piece. It was taken from the window of the ferry crossing to Orcas Island. The camera focused on the cedar-shingled cabin, and then very slowly it panned down. Sitting on the weathered steps of the cabin legs swinging happily was a small boy. He was wearing oversized gardening gloves, carefully examining a ladybug on a blade of grass. He had Maggie's sharp cheekbones and Nathan's undeniable gray eyes. He was legally, irrevocably mine. My voiceover began soft but unbreakable, layered over the image of the boy, finding wonder in the smallest things. Some families are born. Some are stolen. Mine was reclaimed 1 frame at a time. The reel ended. I let the silence hang for a beat, then pressed the button to raise the house lights. Down in the front row, tucked safely into a small sanitized seat built just for him, sat the toddler. He was clutching a tiny, slightly overflowing bucket of free popcorn, his gray eyes wide with concentration, utterly oblivious to the drama that had birthed his quiet existence. 500 strangers stood not applauding the scandal, but applauding the act of survival. They clapped for the woman who had refused to fade to black when the script demanded she be erased. Outside, Seattle rain hissed its gentle, familiar rhythm against the restored marquee. I stepped off the stage, walked past the ushers, and out onto the wet sidewalk. I tilted my face to the cool, clean sky. The reel was mine now. The narrative arc had bent, but it hadn't broken, and the story. It was just getting to the good part.